What's up, everybody? I have prepared a little something on damage in Path of Exile for you. We want to talk about scaling your hit damage in this game. It is one of the most important pieces of theory crafting you can do in an ARPG, and I see questions and comments from people all the time about how they're frustrated because they've followed a guide and their hit damage is half of what it says the person who wrote the guide has achieved, and they don't understand why. It seems like they've checked all the boxes, but sometimes it's a lot of little things. Sometimes it's one big thing that you're missing. It's hard to say without just kind of knowing how damage works in this game. And I figured this was a good time for it. A new league is coming in a couple days. Lots of people are excited. There'll be lots of people who are returning to the game that don't have a lot of experience, brand new players whose friends are getting them into it for the first time. And so I thought this would be something a little different from what a lot of people are posting, which are like very specific changes that folks who are more familiar with the game already will be interested in their analysis of. So let's go through the topics I'm going to cover. So first of all, I'm going to mention a whole bunch of terminology to define different things that I think are important to understanding damage in this game. I also did my best to really be consistent with my language throughout the presentations, and I will do my best to speak in the same way, where I try to use consistent language. It is difficult because there's a lot of colloquial usage of terms in the Reddit community and everything that are not used consistently or just used incorrectly because somebody doesn't have a full understanding of things. But I will do my best to keep it clear and consistent. We're going to talk about damage conversion, increased and reduced damage, which if you've played this game at all, you've probably been exposed to. Attack and cast speed, really common in any ARPG, accuracy, crit chance, and resistance reduction and penetration. So this is definitely intended for beginners. However, I would not be surprised if more intermediate and advanced players don't pick something up here. I have a few thousand hours in this game myself, and I very regularly encounter mechanics that I didn't know existed, I'm unfamiliar with, or have a poor understanding or incorrect understanding of. It's not uncommon for people with thousands of hours in this game to have an incomplete understanding of how damage scaling works. So you still may get something out of it. There are a lot of unique interactions that I won't cover. I may reference some of them because they're really commonly found in the game, even if they're sort of unique. When I say common, it's a very common, unique item that causes the interaction or something like that. Or I may use certain interactions just to clarify a concept, but I will do my best to avoid referencing them if I think it's just going to make it more confusing to understand the concept in general. I'm going to limit the amount of direct math that I show you, at least on the slides. I may, after explaining a concept, quickly rattle off via my audio presentation here some mathematical examples if I think it will help clear up a concept. But originally, as I made this presentation, I filled it with math, and I was like, this is just going to get too ridiculous. People are going to get bored. People are going to get frustrated. They're going to get confused. But please feel free to find my stream or reach out to me, and I would be happy to sort of go through some of this with you per your request. If I get a lot of requests, maybe I'll make a separate video with more examples of some of these concepts. And then finally, just focusing on identifying scaling of your damage, and then also, when it's efficient and when you've reached the point of diminishing returns, and perhaps you should look for another method of scaling to maximally boost your damage. So the first term I want to reference is base damage. So when you are calculating your damage output, most of the things that you multiply together to come out with the final damage output are percentages. But you can't just multiply a whole bunch of percentages together. All you're going to do is finish with some percentage, which is not an amount of damage that you can deal to a target, unless you're talking about a percentage of their health pool. So what you need is you need some base flat damage value for all those percentages to be multiplied by, so that you end up with a flat damage number that you can then deal to a monster. So for attacks, the base damage is provided by the weapon. For spells, the base damage is provided by the skill gem. And I have shown you down here how base damage is modified, the order in which it is modified. So first of all, for weapons, there are modifiers that exist on the weapon. They're called local modifiers that specifically modify the weapon. So what they do is they actually change what your base damage is. There's no other place you can find modifiers except on the weapon that actually change your base damage. So you take the weapon's innate base damage. So what that means is if you were to find a white item on the ground, no stats on it at all, it's just the base core item, it has some base damage. You add any local additive modifiers. So if I go to the next slide right here, this is an example of a local additive modifier. On the red beak sword, adds 2 to 6 physical damage. This directly modifies the base damage of the weapon. Then, all those local additive modifiers are lumped together with the weapon's base damage. They're summed together and then multiplied by local multiplicative modifiers. So again, if you find a multiplicative modifier on the weapon, so this is an example, 50% increased physical damage, it will take the white item rusted sword base damage, add 2 to 6 physical damage, and then the sum of that will be multiplied by 1.5 to increase the physical damage by 50%. That is your base damage. You take that base damage, which is listed right up here, items that have local modifiers or weapons that have local modifiers, the math is done for you. So this 10.2 to 27.2 damage range includes the addition and multiplication done by these local modifiers already. You don't have to do the math. I'm just trying to make it clear in case you get into, let's say, weapon crafting later, you can see sort of the importance of these values. But if you just find a weapon on the ground, just look right here. It tells you what it does or how much base damage it has. So then you take that base damage that's up at the top of the weapon, you add any global additive modifiers. So these are things that are added on top of the base damage from other sources, like on your gear, or let's say on through some ascendancy classes, you can get base damage, etc. There are global multiplicative modifiers. So after you sum those up, the base damage plus these additive modifiers that directly get added on top of the base damage, and then multiply it by any global multiplicative modifiers. These are the most common things you see. Anytime you see something that says percent increased damage, it is a form of global multiplicative modifier. We will go into this more later. And then eventually that equals your damage output. So spells can ignore this whole first bullet point because weapon damage is irrelevant. Instead, on spells, the base damage is listed right here. All right, this is level 20 fireball spell, so this does change with the level of the gem, but otherwise I'm unaware of any way to directly change the base damage, only to add flat values on top of this base damage. So I went ahead and also included some examples of the global modifiers that you can find on gear. So this is a ring that adds physical damage to attacks and cold damage to attacks. These values get added on top of the base damage. As well, this is an example of multiplicative damage modifiers. So if your damage is elemental damage, then it is increased by this percentage. The base damage plus any of these kinds of modifiers is multiplied. The sum of that is multiplied by these guys. We'll go into the specifics of how that works in a little bit. So next we have the damage source. So this is a term that is used to describe where the damage is coming from, and it is a property of the damage. It results in a keyword, which we'll talk about more in a little bit, that is associated with the damage. So these damage properties and keywords are used to know which mechanics they can interact with. So if a mechanic says that it interacts specifically with elemental damage, or in the case of a damage source, with attack damage or spell damage, then it will only modify it if the source is as stated. I specifically highlighted attack and spell here because this is really what we're going to cover. I'm not talking about damage over time today. It's a little bit more complicated and has a whole bunch of additional sort of like idiosyncrasies to the way that you scale it. And it's a little bit more complicated, and I just didn't want to get into it. I feel like this is going to be a long enough presentation already, and most people will be doing the majority of their damage by casting attacks and spells that do hit damage as opposed to damage over time. As well, there are secondary sources, but again, this is not something I want to cover. The mechanics of that also get a little bit more complicated and sometimes unintuitive. So damage can only have one source. Typically tagged on the active skill gem, there are little tags at the top of your skill gem that indicate what the damage source is. So in the case of the ground slam skill, it is an attack. One little thing I will mention is that skills can specifically specify that they are associated with keywords related to another source. So there are spells, for example, that are modified by both spell damage and damage over time related mechanics, but it will specifically say that on the skill gem if that's the case. Just read the description to look for any of those kinds of sort of unique interactions. Next, we have the damage type. So this is not where the damage is coming from, but the form of the damage. So again, it's just another property of the damage, and possible damage types include physical, fire, cold, lightning, or chaos. And again, damage can only have one type. So you can deal multiple kinds of damage with a single skill. However, each type of damage will sort of be separated almost like into an individual packet that is then modified separately by modifiers that apply to that packet of damage. So if you, for example, have something that increases fire damage, even if you are using a skill that deals fire and cold damage, only the fire portion of it will be affected by that modifier. So for the purposes of math, there actually are separate calculations done for each type of damage dealt. So keywords. Keywords are what indicate the properties of damage. So they are just the terms we use to describe the various properties of damage. Damage inherits keywords from the skill causing it. So what that means is if you have a skill that is a spell, is an area of effect spell, for example, then any damage you deal with that spell will be spell damage, and it will be area damage or area of effect damage. So modifiers that affect either one affect that damage because that damage has both of those properties since it is a property of the skill causing the damage. So it can also be associated with other keywords that have nothing to do with the skill itself. So, for example, you can have a skill that has no damage type association at all. It's not associated with fire damage, cold damage, anything. It's just associated with weapon damage, which could be anything. But it could have the elemental tag if you've added elemental damage from some other source, like let's say the ring that I showed you a picture of earlier that adds cold damage to attacks. Well, that packet of damage, that bit of cold damage, would interact with any mechanics that are related to elemental damage, whether or not the skill gem itself has the cold tag on it. So there are other keywords to be aware of that may allow different mechanics to interact with that damage despite the skill not having that property inherently. So the damage modifiers apply based on keywords. That is pretty much what I was trying to say, but summarized it right there for you. So here's an example of the sort of inheriting of keywords. If you use the skill Reave, any damage you deal would be modified by things that alter attack damage, area of effect damage or area damage, or melee damage. Any of them would apply to the damage dealt by this. Doesn't matter if it's cold, if it's fire, if it's whatever, it's also attack damage, it's also area damage, it's also melee. You create a list of different keywords and properties that interact with the various mechanics in the game. So next we have damage modifiers. So I've kind of used this term a bunch already. As you can imagine, they are things that modify your damage. Mostly, really, today we're focusing on things that increase your damage, but there are modifiers that can decrease your damage in some form or fashion as well. So, as I said, they only apply if the damage has the associated keywords, right? If it has those properties. So it needs to be a modifier that matches up with what kind of damage it is, the type, the source, or any other properties. The modifiers can be conditional, and what that means is even if the keywords associated with the damage match, there is some other condition that also has to be met before the modifier actually affects the damage. So I threw some common examples here. So the first one listed on there, recently, just means that some effect has to have happened recently in order for the damage modifier listed to take effect. So as an example of that, on this page here, I posted a picture of the Razor of the Seventh Sun sword. There are two conditional modifiers on it. One, if you've ignited an enemy recently. So if you've ignited any enemy at all, doesn't matter if it's the one you're hitting now, if in the last 4 seconds you've ignited some enemy somewhere, then you will deal 100% increased burning damage. Against ignited enemies is the condition right here. 100% increased melee physical damage against ignited enemies. So what that means is if the enemy currently has the ignite elemental status ailment inflicted upon them, then any damage you deal while that is true will get a 100% increased melee physical damage bonus to it. And I just stuck a couple of other conditional modifiers, critical strike being because it's chance-based. So there's no way to know for certain until that chance has been rolled whether the damage you're dealing right now is from a critical strike or not. Some also may care about what kind of enemy you're hitting. So I showed in the image with the Razor of the Seventh Sun an ignited enemy. Also could be some keyword associated with the enemy that you're hitting, a rare or unique enemy. That's a common one that you see. Damage modifiers may require extra calculations to generate the effective damage modification. So what I mean by that is when you're calculating damage, you have your base, you add any flat damage on top of that, sum it all up, and then that gets multiplied by a whole bunch of other numbers. So if you have a 200% increase, you would multiply that base by 3. If you have 2 attacks per second, then you would multiply that number by 2, etc., for all the other modifiers, one after the other. But those numbers, the times 3, times 2, those values sometimes are not obvious from the actual stats that you're getting from your gear. So for example, accuracy is a flat value, but it kind of gets converted into a percentage chance to hit, which is then the actual modifier that gets multiplied by your base damage. So sometimes there is some extra calculation that has to happen in order to get the true multiplier that's being applied to your base damage, right? And so these are just common examples. Again, critical strikes are chance-based, so you have to do some math to figure out your average damage over time. because there is only a certain percentage chance that you're going to get that bonus. So many skills also have a damage effectiveness multiplier on them that applies to additive modifiers. So what that means is if you have some additional source of added flat damage on a piece of gear, whether it be, let's say, on a wand, it could be on a ring, whatever, then it gets added at a lower value than is indicated on the actual item. So here's an example. This is the skill Blade Vortex. This damage effectiveness that I've highlighted here is 25%. So you only take 25% of whatever the amount of damage is that's being added on top of your base, and add that 25% portion. Mostly this is done because there are skills that hit multiple times per use, or conversely or additionally get some other kind of benefit. So for example, Blade Vortex is a skill that you can stack up to 10 times, and for each stack the hit rate goes up per stack. So things could snowball out of control really quickly if the same flat value is added to this as was added to another skill that is just one normal use, and per use you get that flat amount. It tries to balance the scales so that the flat amount being added to this has a similar value to the flat amount being added to something else. This effectiveness modifier does not mean that it's bad to add flat damage to Blade Vortex. It is not. But I just thought that you should be aware of it because it may result in an outcome different from what you expect, and it's something you see all over the place, and it could possibly in some cases indicate that it's not very efficient to add additional flat damage, so like global additive modifiers to your base damage. It may in some cases. It may in some cases indicate that it's a really good idea to do it as well. Okay, so more about damage modifiers. When we say more or less, these are always separate multiplicative modifiers. They don't get lumped together with any other modifier that's out there. It's a pure multiplicative modifier. So if something says you're going to get 30% more damage, no matter what other modifiers are being applied to your damage, you will always get 30% more as a result of applying that modifier to the damage. Generally, the more modifiers come from support skills or keystones or unique items sometimes. So separate multiplicative modifiers are always better than an aggregated equivalent. So what that means is that 100% increased damage is always worse than 100% more. Technically speaking, if it's the first 100% in that case, they are equal at that moment. But the reason I say it's always better is because it future-proofs your damage. Because now, if you have the choice between adding either one, you always want to take the thing that says more damage, because it means that in the future, any other types of aggregated multiplier, like increased damage, will be more efficient because you haven't summed up as much together and start hitting those diminishing returns. So it's always better, even if at that moment they are of equivalent value, it's better for the future upgrades of your build. Other multiplicative modifiers, the same description, are aggregated into one. So this is what I was just alluding to a moment ago. So if you take, for example, a modifier that says percent increased damage, you take 5 different percent increased damage modifiers. Let's say you have 5 that all increase your damage by 50%. They get added together, so 50% plus 50%, 5 times, is 250%. So that will create one big aggregated multiplier, right? So a 250% increase, in order to apply that to your base damage, you would multiply your base damage by 3.5. In the case of, let's say, separate multiplicative modifiers that all said more, if they all said 50% more, instead of saying your base damage times 3.5, it would be your base damage times 1.5 times 1.5 times 1.5 times 1.5 times 1.5, or times 1.5 to the 5th power. So you can see how those will grow really quickly compared to the more modifiers will grow really quickly compared to the aggregated multipliers like these. So another simple example is if you, let's say you were to take your base damage and multiply it by 2, multiply it by 2 again, and then multiply it by 2 a final time, you'd be doing 8 times the original damage. Whereas if you added up 2 plus 2 plus 2 into one aggregate multiplier and multiplied it by the base damage, you would only be doing 6 times your base damage. So that's just a simple mathematical example to illustrate how stacking those separate multiplicative modifiers can get a lot of additional value. I just put a couple of other examples here. We will go into these in a little bit more detail later. An important concept, though, to keep in mind is that these aggregated modifiers, as I said, become less efficient as the sum increases. So the greater number of increased damage modifiers you have summed up together, the less valuable an additional one will be. So if you only have increased your damage so far by 100%, then another 100% increase in damage is absolutely massive. It ends up meaning you're dealing 50% more damage. If instead you have 1000% increased damage, then that additional 100% increased damage is actually only going to increase your damage by, it's going to be less than 10%. It's about 9%. So it's a huge difference in terms of the value it's adding currently. And so what that means is at any given time, as you start piling up one particular aggregated modifier, so you have lots of increases, you should seek to find other separate multipliers, either the more multipliers referenced up here, or some different aggregated multiplier like increased damage taken or X% of Y damage added as Z, which I'll show you an example of on the next page here, in the next couple pages. So I highlighted here two aggregated multipliers that use the same language, right? Nearby enemies take blank % increased physical damage. So the nearby is actually has nothing to do with the damage modifier. This is just a condition, like I mentioned earlier, right? So these modifiers won't kick in unless you are close to the enemy, whatever nearby happens to mean, some number of units away from them or closer. But the take % increased physical damage and take % increased physical damage right here get added together into one. So let's say this 11%, if we pretend that we're using a level 20 war banner, gets added to the take 9% increased physical damage from this item I just found on the trade site. They would get added together so that the enemy is taking 20% increased physical damage. And then any additional increased damage taken modifiers, even if they don't specify physical damage, would get lumped together with these guys. That's kind of why I use this example. This is another sort of common one. It's not as common as just pure increases, though. Okay, so we'll go ahead and talk about damage conversion next. I apologize, too. I referenced a slide that's a few slides away as far as one particular mod, but we're going to kind of touch on it in more detail here anyway. So, damage conversion. You're changing one type of damage into another type of damage. And it always occurs in this specific order. Physical is converted to lightning, into cold, into fire, into chaos. And this consistent order of conversion exists simply to prevent infinite loops, where if you converted one type of damage to another, and then that type of damage back to the original, it wouldn't happen infinitely. Conversion can be full or partial. You can convert 10% or 100%. Of course, you can't convert more than 100%, but you can convert anywhere between 0 and 100% to a different damage type, of one type to another. As long as it exists in this order, so you could not convert cold damage to lightning damage. You can, however, convert lightning damage to cold damage, or lightning to fire. You can skip steps. The partial conversion will create a separate damage packet. So kind of like I was describing earlier, any damage that you deal with your skill that is of a different type than another type is calculated separately. So I'm referring to it as a damage packet, but all that I'm really describing is that you have a separate set of calculations being performed on this type of damage and a separate set being performed on this type of damage. Converted damage is affected by modifiers to previous damage types. So if you convert physical to, let's say, fire damage, for example, then if we assume a 100% conversion from physical to fire, then when you deal that fire damage, any modifiers that increase physical or increase fire will both affect it. So it kind of remembers what type of damage that it once was. Conversion totaling more than 100% is scaled. So what that means is if you have multiple sources of damage conversion and they all add up to be more than 100%, they will be scaled to maintain their appropriate ratio to one another so that they add up to 100%. So if we pretend that you have three sources that all convert 50% of physical damage to a different element, let's say 50 to fire, 50 to cold, 50 to lightning, they will actually all be scaled so that ultimately you will deal 1/3 of each element, right? Because the ratio is 1 to 1 to 1, 50 to 50 to 50. Conversion inherent to a skill gem cannot be scaled. So some skills on the gem inherently convert some type of damage to another type of damage. Generally, it's physical. I'm not aware of any skill gems. There are some support gems that convert one element to another. So any additional conversion that you get from different sources, if it exceeds whatever's remaining, so let's say the skill converts 50% physical damage to fire damage inherently, then any other modifiers you get, let's say you get another 50% physical converted to fire and then another 50% physical converted to cold, those two will be scaled within the remaining 50% that was not converted inherently by the skill gem. So in that situation, you would deal 75% fire, right? 50 inherently from the skill gem, 25 from the 50% conversion that has to get squeezed into the remaining 50% in conjunction with the 50% cold, and 25% cold, right? So the 50 and the 50 had to get scaled to fit into a single 50, aka they were cut in half. So there's another mod that you see a lot in this game. It says X% of Y damage added to Z. I referenced it earlier. Right? It's sort of a form of another aggregated damage multiplier. And it is an interesting mechanic because it does have a sort of unique interaction that I do feel is worth mentioning here because you actually encounter it fairly often in this game. So, and it's also worth noting that it's not conversion, so you're not changing the original damage type. You're merely saying, all right, if you deal 100 damage and I add 20% of physical damage as extra cold damage, I'm just giving myself a straight up 20% bonus of extra cold damage. So you take that 100, you add 20% on top, now you deal the full 100 physical damage plus another 20 cold damage. So it's a pretty powerful stat in this game. But the sort of unique interaction is that this also in some ways doesn't remember the previous types that it was. Well, it does. It kind of has that same inherited thing that I referenced earlier, where if you have physical damage that was converted to an element, then both elemental damage modifiers and physical damage modifiers affect that elemental damage. Well, the same is kind of true for this particular stat here. So if you have, let's say, damage that was physical, it gets converted to lightning, and we're just pretending full 100% conversion for simplicity's sake here. That lightning damage is 100% converted to cold. That cold damage is 100% converted to fire. Then if you have a mod that says you know, 50% of elemental damage added as chaos damage, then you take 50% of the physical, 50%, if it says elemental, then you take 50% of the lightning, 50% of the cold, and 50% of the fire, and you take all of those and add it as one big massive bonus on top. If it were to say non-chaos instead of elemental, then it would also, in that situation, take 50% of that original physical damage and add it on top as well. There are, again, some commonly used examples of this in the game. So here's one of them. Itziri's Promise. Itziri's Promise is a flask that is commonly available within a day or two of a league, on the first day usually. And so here's an example of just taking physical damage as extra chaos damage. This is kind of the simpler form of the bonus I was talking about, but it also has another stat on it that interacts with this more complicated scenario that I'm describing, where if you've converted your damage multiple times, then the 10 to 15% of elemental damage will add the lightning, the cold, and the fire, as long as the damage was that type at one point, on top as an extra bonus. So this stat right here really likes multiple kinds of damage conversion. And then I just highlighted right here an example of a skill that has inherent damage conversion on the skill gem. It just says it right there, 60% of physical damage converted to lightning damage. This will always happen. So in the case of the skill Static Strike, any additional conversions you get, if they exceed 40% in total, will be scaled to maintain the same ratio but add up to 40%. So you will always do at least 60% physical damage as lightning damage, or converted to lightning damage. You'll always do at least that amount. You could do some more if you further convert to lightning damage from some other source, but you could also do a combination. Okay, next is increases and reductions to damage. So this is the most common aggregated multiplicative modifier in the game by far. I referenced that earlier. You find it all over gear, you find it all over your skill tree, you find it in ascendancies, etc. So you find it in buffs. There's a lot of buffs that do it. So it is worth noting that thus these experience very heavy diminishing returns as a result of that. Because they're so common and you end up aggregating a ton of them together, they form this really large value that, relatively speaking, any further increases to will be small, and thus the diminishing returns. And also, as I said earlier, they're all aggregated into one, even if the keyword associations are different. As long as that keyword applies to your damage, they're all lumped into one aggregate modifier. And as an example of that, so I took 3 different items here. So this one increases spell damage. This one increases elemental damage. I showed you this item earlier. And this one increases lightning damage. So even though the phrasing of what keywords they need the damage to have in order to be an active modifier of it, even though they're different, they all say increased, and therefore they're actually just summed together. So you would take, let's pretend, we'll just assume the highest rolls here, 60% plus 32% plus 100% plus 20%. You would add them all together into one big aggregate modifier, as long as you are dealing lightning damage and it's spell damage. And if it's lightning damage, then it's elemental damage. This is not to be confused with increased damage taken. That is the one I showed you an image of earlier, where I showed you 2 items that had increased physical damage taken on them. That is a separate aggregated multiplicative modifier. So just be aware of that difference. This one is significantly more powerful because it is a lot less common. So next, attack and cast speed, an important stat that you find in basically any ARPG. In this game, base attack speed is determined by the weapon. So the weapon will have a base attack speed listed up at the top, right here, just like that earlier image I showed you where I highlighted how the base damage is shown at the top. The base attack speed is also shown at the top of this item, and it also, like the base damage, has any math done locally already for you. So if you just find a rare item or unique item on the ground, you don't need to worry about this local modifier down here to attack speed, which works very much the same way as it did with base damage. This math is done for you. The base attack speed of a Veil Axe is, I think, 1.2 attacks per second, so it's already been multiplied by this modifier here by 1.12 to 1.16. So just for consistency's sake, I did show down here the equation or the order of operations used to get your base attack speed, which is just the white item attack speed, right? So the base times any local multiplicative modifiers. So that 1.2 that I said would show up here if this was a white item that Veil Axes have times this local modifier. And then there are global additive modifiers. You can mostly ignore this. For the most part, these don't exist, but the only reason I even mention it is because technically the same thing happens here that does with base damage, and there are some movement skills that actually take this into consideration. Those movement skills listed as attack time, and so you have to do some finagling with the math in order to find out truly what global addition to your base attack speed, or actually reduction to your base attack speed in the case of those, is happening. But I wouldn't worry about it too much. That's not really important for damage scaling. Generally, people aren't using those particular movement skills for their primary damage. They are there for utility purposes. And then you multiply by global multiplicative modifiers, and so this is true for cast speed as well. So you take that base cast speed or attack speed and multiply it by any percent increases to attack or cast speed. One additional thing to note about cast speed, besides being able to ignore this, right, because it doesn't care about your weapon's attack speed, it only cares about the cast speed of the skill, which is on the skill gem. And skill gems actually list it as the inverse. So it doesn't say your cast speed, it says your cast time, which all you have to do is take 1 and divide it by 0.7 to get your cast speed. So if the cast time is 0.7 seconds, then you're actually doing 1.43 casts per second as a base. Increases to attack or cast speed are almost always an efficient means of increasing damage. This one is the second most common, probably after increases to damage. So it does experience a healthy amount of diminishing returns, but generally speaking, attack or cast speed are pretty effective ways to scale your damage. You should still always be aware of diminishing returns, but I would say that as a general rule of thumb, attack or cast speed is a pretty good choice, but still it's never going to be as good as a separate multiplicative modifier. So if you can support your skills with more modifiers as opposed to something that further increases attack or cast speed, this is going to lose. It's still another aggregated multiplicative modifier, right? You're still adding up all the increases to attack speed into one big lump sum, and therefore diminishing returns will still kick in, even though it happens to a lesser degree than with your increases to damage. Just as a reference, in 3.7, I don't have an image for this because it doesn't exist yet, but in 3.7 there will be attack speed effectiveness multipliers on skill gems, similar to how there are damage effectiveness multipliers like I showed you earlier on Blade Vortex. So this attack speed effectiveness multiplier, I assume, works basically the same way, where if it says 50%, then if you try to increase your attack speed by 10%, instead it will only add half of that value and actually only increase it by 5%. I'm assuming. So next we have accuracy. So this is not something that spellcasters need to be concerned with, you lucky dogs. It only affects attacks. It is compared against enemy evasion to determine chance to hit. So I referenced this earlier as an important stat, but one that needs some mathematical finagling before you truly find what the multiplier is that affects your damage. And that's because accuracy is actually provided in the form of a flat value. So you could have 2,000 total accuracy, 3,000 total accuracy. And then that gets compared against your enemy's evasion rating, which is another flat value. And that determines your chance to hit. So your chance to hit is actually not the same against all enemies. And in fact, this is going to be even more important in the upcoming patch because basic white monsters are going to have significantly lower evasion values than tougher monsters are. The developers have indicated. So, some additional info related to this: monster evasion increases with level and with modifiers. So if you're in a zone that's level 50, or if you're in a zone that's level 80, the monster's evasion rating will be higher in the level 80 zone. And as well, there are modifiers either on the monster. Let's say it's a rare monster that has the evasive property. It's going to have a higher evasion rating than monsters that don't, assuming the same zone level. Additionally, if you're familiar with mapping yet, in maps, there are like global modifiers that affect all the monsters in the zone, and there can be modifiers that alter their evasion rating as well. Chance to hit is used a second time to determine if a critical strike succeeds. So, if you have a 90% chance to hit an enemy based on the comparison of your accuracy to their evasion, then when you swing at the enemy, 9 out of 10 times that hit will connect. If then you, let's say, have a 50% critical strike chance, half of the time that you successfully hit, you will roll a critical strike. Well, then that can still fail, because then you now have a 10% chance that the critical strike fails. So functionally, your critical strike chance gets reduced by having poor accuracy, in addition to your chance to hit. So critical strike builds care about accuracy more than most. More than any other, really. Chance to hit cannot exceed 100%. Just kind of logic. There's no way you can more than guarantee hit an enemy. And I think there's also actually a minimum value of 5%. Hopefully you're never anywhere near that, because you will want to smash your keyboard if that's the case. Chance to hit is estimated on your character sheet. So I showed an example here. This is some old character of mine that's chilling in standard. So main hand chance to hit, 89%. So the estimation assumes that you're in a zone where monster level is equal to your character level. The highest zone level in the game is 84. So if you're above level 84, then it just assumes that you're in a level 84 zone. So technically, my chance to hit is significantly higher than this on this level 90 character if I'm in a lower level zone. Right? But at worst, against enemies that have no bonuses to evasion or anything, my chance to hit was 89%. Hits can't be evaded, and Resolute Technique sets your chance to hit to 100%. Just worth mentioning, it doesn't even care about blind or anything like that, because you are guaranteed to hit them. As far as I know, there's nothing that supersedes that in the game, and it was kind of worth mentioning these specific stats. So this is one you can find with certain ascendancies or on some gear, and this is a keystone that you can find on your passive tree, are really commonly used and very powerful potentially. So I felt it was worth mentioning these particular stats. So let's go into critical strikes next. Actually, one quick aside. So accuracy, it will always negatively impact your damage. What I should say is the multiplier that comes from it will always negatively impact your damage, or at best, it will be neutral, right? Because if I have an 89% chance to hit, I don't have any way of increasing this over 100%. So I actually don't have any way of positively modifying my base damage, because all I can do at best is get it to be multiplied by 1, which means there is no change. In this case, my base damage would be multiplied by 0.89, excuse me, to calculate my average damage over time. So that doesn't mean that you can't derive a lot of benefit from increasing your accuracy, because effectively what you're doing is you're still aggregating some additional values on top of this if you improve your accuracy. So what do I mean by that? Let's say you have 70% accuracy. So whatever your base damage is, you multiply it by 0.7. And that is your average damage over time with a 70% accuracy rating. Assuming let's pretend crits don't exist right now. So if you were to increase your accuracy to, say, 91%, then you've changed that 0.7 to a 0.91. So you've actually boosted your damage by 30%, right? Because multiplying your base times 0.91 is the same as multiplying your base times 0.7 and then times 1.3. So you need to evaluating the boost you get from improvements to chance to hit is a little bit trickier, but it's ultimately the same concept as with others, where you're looking at the relative change to whatever the existing value is. So the change from 70% chance to hit to 91% chance to hit, or the change from 50 to 100 or whatever. The concept is the same as any other aggregate multiplier. So just be aware of that, but you actually can never positively modify your base damage. You can only positively modify what your current damage is. Hate those bastards taking my damage. So, critical strike chance. Let's go into that next. So again, this is another one where you need to do a little mathematical finagling to find out sort of the true damage multiplier that is being multiplied by your base damage to calculate what your average damage is over time. So, base critical strike chance is determined by your weapon for attacks. You should get used to seeing this, right? Attacks, they find all the bases related to attacks are found on the weapon. And skill gem for spells. So, similar to base damage and base attack speed on weapons, the base crit chance is shown up at the top, and the math is done for you. Again, the same kind of thing, where if there are modifiers on the item that are local, are already calculated in and factored in, because this Judgment Staff base item actually has a base crit chance, and then this increased critical strike chance modifies that. Alright, so I won't walk through this whole thing. It's the same concept as earlier with base damage and base attack speed, basically. And then as well, on spells, there's a critical strike base chance value that's listed right here. Okay, so, and similarly, spells thus can ignore this first part, because all this is doing is just showing you how the local weapon modifiers impact base crit chance. So after a hit is determined to be a crit, chance to hit is applied again. I mentioned this a little bit earlier to determine its success or failure. So as a result, a chance to hit is very important for critical strike builds, because it can negatively modify your damage output twice. So technically, the more impactful roll is the one that checks to see if you hit in the first place, because the one that is modifying crit chance only means that you fail to hit some percentage of the time, because you're not going to crit every time. So it's like a conditional second roll, right? The second roll doesn't happen every single time you hit. It only happens whatever percentage of the time you crit. So technically, or theoretically, if you have 100% critical strike chance, which is very possible, I've made characters with 100% crit chance in this game, then chance to hit is rolled twice with full impact the second time. So the higher your crit chance, the more important chance to hit is too. So let's go ahead and take a look at this lucky critical strike chance modifier. Again, as sort of a very, I feel like, specific modifier that I almost didn't want to cover, but because you can get these things called diamond flasks relatively easily, even as a quest reward, it's just something you're going to be exposed to, and so I felt like it was important to talk about. But essentially, you get 2 chances to successfully roll a critical strike. So the better outcome is taken. So if you roll twice, one the first time fails, the second one succeeds, then the crit will succeed, right? If both rolls fail, then you still won't crit, but the point is that you have to fail that crit chance roll twice in a row, so you dramatically improve your odds of getting a critical strike. But because of the way the math works, as you approach 100% crit chance or 0% crit chance, lucky critical strikes are less effective, right? If you have a 100% crit chance, lucky is useless because you're guaranteed to succeed on your first roll. And conversely, if you have 0% crit chance, lucky critical strike chance is also useless because you're guaranteed to fail on both rolls. So that sweet mid-range where most people sit with their critical strike builds take the most advantage of it. So, 20 to 80%, 30 to 70%, somewhere in there is the sweet spot where you actually reap the most benefit from lucky critical strikes. So the crit chance shown on your character sheet is, it does not factor in chance to hit or lucky critical strikes. So I'll show you right here. On your character sheet, it does tell you what your crit chance is. But again, this doesn't factor in your chance to fail because of accuracy. So really, my true crit chance is only 89% of this, because you remember this character had an 89% chance to hit against most enemies. Additionally, it does not factor in whether your critical strikes are lucky or not. And so often this is referred to as effective crit chance, right? Sort of your true chance to get a critical strike. But the reason it's referenced separately here is there could be things that modify your crit chance, and they don't care about your effective crit chance, right? Effective crit chance just describes out in an actual combat situation what is the chance that you're going to crit. But when you have things that modify crit chance, they only care about, right? If you have something that says increased critical strike chance, it doesn't care about effective crit chance. It cares about the base and other multiplicative modifiers and additive modifiers to that base. All right, so this is why there's an important distinction there. So global additive modifiers to crit chance are generally more powerful than global multiplicative modifiers. So if you have an item or skill or whatever that says this have +% chance to crit, like that is a global additive modifier. So it takes your base and then adds on top of that, just like with attack speed, just like with really damage. You see that more with damage, and then sums that up with your base chance before any of the multiplicative modifiers, like this guy right here, % increased critical strike chance, are multiplied by that base plus added global modifier, additive global modifier. So generally, if you see +% chance to crit, it's going to be more powerful than % increased. With that said, there's always going to be this interplay between the two where % increases, multiplicative modifiers will be more powerful if you have a big base, right? If you had a 50% base, you wouldn't need very many % increased critical strike chance modifiers to scale your damage. Whereas if you have a 1% base, you could have 1,000% increased critical strike chance as a multiplicative modifier, and your crit chance still wouldn't be very high. So you want a healthy balance between the two, but simply because the multiplicative modifiers are way more common, right? You're going to see a lot more modifiers that look like this, % increased critical strike chance, as opposed to +% to critical strike chance, because you see a lot more of these these additive modifiers tend to be more valuable because you just reach diminishing returns so much later. It's really hard to stack too much of this. I don't want to say impossible, but it's really hard to stack so much of this that this becomes a more efficient stat. So, just as a reference, this interplay does exist between all the multiplicative modifiers in the game, where the more you have of one, the less effective it is, and the more powerful the others are. So we'll come back and kind of tie it all in at the end. Okay, so now crit multiplier. So you can see crit's a little more complicated, but definitely worth talking about because it's a really common mechanic in this game. So default critical strike multiplier is 150%. So by default, when you crit, you will do 50% more damage with that hit compared to a non-critical strike hit. Critical strike chance functionally acts like an effectiveness modifier to crit multiplier. Remember, it's chance-based, so although critical strikes by default deal 50% more damage, unless you have 100% critical strike chance, you're not going to deal 50% more damage, period. You're only going to deal 50% more damage some percentage of the time. So if your crit chance was, let's say, 50%, then you would be multiplying that 50% by this bonus 50%, right? So you'd only get 25% more damage if you had 50% crit chance with the base multiplier, right? Because it's only half effective. If you have 100% crit chance, it's fully effective. If you have 75, then you would need to multiply this by 75, or 0.75. Just the bonus part is what's being modified. Increased critical strike multiplier is generally more effective than crit chance for improving average damage output. Again, just like I showed you on this slide, there's an interplay between the additive increases and the multiplicative increases to crit chance. Well, there's another layer of that where, because crit chance and crit multiplier are multiplied together to figure out your true damage multiplier, then one of the values being really high means that the other one is more effective, and that one is less effective to scale, right? Again, if you have a whole bunch of something, then the relative increase you're going to get is small. But if you have a whole bunch of this, and it's getting multiplied by this tiny value over here, then this tiny value, you're making a larger relative increase, which is getting multiplied by this already big value. So the point is, crit multiplier is more effective if you have a high crit chance, and crit chance is more effective if you have a high crit multi. So you want to keep the proper balance as you're scaling your build, even though generally crit multiplier is going to be more efficient generally. So total critical strike multiplier is indicated on your character sheet, but it does not include any conditional bonuses that are dependent on external factors. So similar to how crit chance doesn't indicate, if it doesn't change if you're lucky or not, this crit multiplier won't change based on conditional modifiers unless that conditional modifier actually affects you, right? So let's say you have a bonus critical strike multiplier while you have full health. Well, it actually should be reflected in your character sheet if you do have full health, but some conditions like that can't really be predicted by your character sheet. So for example, if it says critical strike multiplier plus % critical strike multiplier against a unique enemy. If that's the case, this character sheet has no way of knowing if you're hitting a unique enemy or you are hitting a normal enemy. It has no way to distinguish, so that conditional bonus won't be added here. So just so you're aware, if you look at this and it seems lower than you think it should be, make sure you're not depending on too many conditional bonuses, or at least you're able to easily meet those conditions. So next we have resistance reduction and penetration. So Enemies can have resistances to the type of damage you do. Technically speaking, they have armor and therefore have some small amount of resistance to your physical damage. I'm going to ignore that simply because currently the armor values on armor or on monsters are really low by default, and so it's largely ignorable. And also, there's no way to penetrate armor or physical resistance in the game currently. So going into that wouldn't have very much value because you can't really do anything about it anyway. However, these same general concepts, should that become a mechanic that's added into the game later, should apply, as far as I know, if we're talking about physical damage resistance, in theory, sometime in the future. But anyway, base white enemies don't have any resistances, as far as I know, to elemental or chaos damage. But map bosses or, let's say, endgame bosses like the Shaper do have resistances. As well, maps can have modifiers that change enemy resistances, and also enemies can have modifiers that give them some kind of bonus, right? A rare monster has extra elemental resistances, or something like that. So, if an enemy's resistances are factored in, then you actually have to aggregate them with whatever resistance reduction you're putting on them and whatever penetration you have. So it's similar to the concept I referenced earlier with accuracy, right? Where accuracy, by default, if you have less than 100% accuracy, it negatively modifies your damage, your base damage output. Well, similarly, if you're hitting an enemy that has resistances to the type of damage you're dealing, well, you're getting some negative modifier to your damage output, right? If an enemy has 25% resistance to fire damage and you deal all fire damage, then whatever your base damage is, you need to multiply it by 0.75 and then do the rest of your calculations. And that will be your damage output. So you need to aggregate any changes to their resistances and your penetration with their current resistance to figure out the true multiplier that's being applied to your damage. And similar to what I said earlier, you can also figure out sort of the relative change. Currently, if you are dealing less than 100% of your base damage because they have resistances, then those increases will be relatively more impactful than if they had no resistances at all. So, for example, let's pretend an enemy has 50% resistance to an element, and you deal all damage of that element, let's say fire damage again. They have 50% fire resistance. Well, if you get 50% fire penetration, then that's effectively like they have 0 resistance. So you've gone from dealing half damage to full damage. Going from 0.5 to 1 is doubling your damage, right? So that 50% penetration would double your damage. Whereas if the enemy has no resistances and you have 50 fire pen, then you're going from 1 to 1.5 times your damage. So therefore, you're only increasing it by 50%. So the point is that resistance reduction and penetration is more efficient against enemies that have higher resistances. So basically, it helps against bosses, and it helps against enemies in maps that have map mods or whatever that are giving them bonus resistances. Right? And the concept here is the same. They're diminishing your turns when you aggregate into a single multiplier. So the more penetration you stack, the less effective it is, right? And their resistances are kind of like a minus to what your penetration is. You can think of it in that way too. So it's a little harder to hit a point of really, really bad diminishing returns with penetration, simply because against the enemies that really matter, the higher health enemies, you're already starting at a negative. So any additions you add on top of it, it's hard to total up enough that you're not getting a pretty effective damage boost out of it. But you still have to compare it to your other options, right? It's always relative. So, enemy resistances can be reduced or penetrated to negative numbers. So I just kind of said this, right? Penetration and reduction are still useful against enemies that have no resistance. It's just not as powerful as it is against enemies that do have resistances. Reduction actually modifies the enemy resistances based on overcapped values. So if you're fighting a map boss, let's say, and the map has multiple modifiers that give them bonus elemental resistances, well, elemental resistances by default in this game are capped at 75%. So they can, in theory, actually have a resistance value that's above 75. It will still function at 75, but the game is aware of how much resistance they have past that cap. And so when you're reducing enemy resistances, let's say with a curse, it actually reduces that overcapped value. So if an enemy had, let's say, I would just pretend 200% resistance to something, right? It would function like 75% with respect to damage calculations. But if you tried to reduce their resistances, the first 125% reduction would be useless because it would only bring them to that functional cap they're already at. Penetration does not care about overcapped resistances, meaning it only cares about sort of their functional resistance to something after reductions have already taken place. Just wanted to reference this. We're not really talking about damage over time, but I wanted to just throw it in there that damage over time, just to illustrate just a difference between reduction and penetration, since we're talking about them, damage over time is unaffected by penetration. This stat has no impact on damage over time. All right, but reduction does help, right? Reduction does for damage over time, but penetration does not contribute to damage over time. All right, so these are the major concepts. We're going to try and tie it all together here. Hopefully we got through that without me confusing you with tons of terminology and everything. And I look forward to getting questions from people, and hopefully people popping in the stream and asking me to show them math and stuff. I would love that. That'd be awesome. But here are the major concepts that kind of tie everything together, hopefully, that you can keep in your mind as you're trying to maximize the damage output of your character. So aggregated damage modifiers have diminishing returns. So if you have a damage modifier that's being added together with other modifiers of the same type, that will be lumped together in one big multiplier to your base damage. So the more that you have of that one, the less effective further increases are. So again, examples would be increased damage taken, some percentage of one type of damage added as another type of damage. All of these are forms of aggregated damage modifiers. Critical strike multiplier is too, where if you stack too much, eventually they're not all that effective anymore. Adding additional multipliers will always be efficient. So if you have the option of adding a more damage modifier, as long as it's a reasonably high value, right? 1% more damage. Okay, it's not very much. But generally, this is going to be the best way to go if you have the ability to add more damage. More indicates it will always be a separate multiplier by itself. It does not get aggregated with anything. It is the true multiplier to your damage. And they are very efficient. When you increase a damage multiplier, all other damage multipliers become more efficient. That one becomes less efficient. So that ties into this, right? If you are taking one particular damage modifier, again, let's say increased damage, if you stack a lot of that together, then other aggregated multipliers are going to be better to modify because the relative increase there will be higher. So you don't want to just stack up one aggregated multiplier, right? Attack speed or increased damage or damage taken as. You don't want to just stack one like crazy. You want to distribute them to the different multipliers, and that will give you the best total damage output. Obviously, you have to compare the specific available values you have on your gear or gear you plan to get to see what's more efficient. But the point is, as a general practice, you want to try to contribute to all those different multipliers, right? Rather than just stacking one a ton. So, just as a bonus concept, this is not something I really talked about, but I think is important because people see all the time folks go on forums and whatever and post their guides. 3 million DPS, this character, blah, 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 blah. Wow, that's so much damage. Cool. I really want to look into that. Okay, that's great and all, but you have to consider whether in real world scenarios that damage output is realistic, right? Are there a ton of conditional modifiers for that damage that are hard to meet, right? Is it only damage that's bonuses that occur if you've killed monsters recently and therefore isn't going to be as effective against bosses? Are they temporary buffs from flasks? All that kind of stuff. Most builds will have some amount of that. But there are also even sort of more difficult kind of functional damage modifiers to pay attention to. So leading into this league, there's this big boost to melee fighting mechanics and all that. And I've had some discussions with folks on Reddit where I said, well, melee by default has a negative damage multiplier all the time, at least in bossing scenarios, right? And for tough fights. And the reason is because the damage per second that you might calculate, is just theoretical. If you just stood there and were able to just stand there and wail on the character until they die, then yes, that's how much damage you might do with all your buffs up and everything. But in reality, what you do is you get in close to them, you hit them for some period of time, and then you have to dodge tough mechanics. If you've ever fought Uber Elder before with anything but like a crazy, overpowered, super mirror tier, crazy, geared out build, you know that your damage uptime is pretty low. So whatever the damage is on your character sheet, you might be doing 20% of that, 30%, I don't know, it depends a lot on the character, on your dodging mechanics, whatever, all that kind of stuff. But the point is that your true damage output is a lot less than what it says on the sheet. That's why sometimes you see people finishing a fight like the Uber Elder fight pretty quickly with low damage output builds. I've seen characters with 300,000 damage output kill Uber Elder faster than characters that have multiple times that because they have nearly 100% damage uptime. A great example of that is Stormbrand. You cast the brands on them, and then it just continues to do damage, and then you can just constantly dodge. So while you are dodging, this damage is being dealt. And so your real world damage output, at least in tough fights, is quite a bit higher. A similar thing exists with damage over time, and we didn't go into scaling it, but just to reference it, a lot of people, I've had a lot of arguments with people where I say, I think bleed is better than people think it is. And part of that is because of melee's poor damage uptime against really tough fights. What ends up happening is when you have some source of damage that's dealing damage while you're out of combat, that ends up being up 80% of the time if your damage, your ability to attack exists only 20% of the time. So even if it deals a lot less damage, it's happening 4 times as much, right? Just in this, with these theoretical numbers, these numbers may not be accurate. But my point is that although on a character sheet it looks bad, right? People, they put it in Path of Building, which is a theory crafting tool, and they see, wow, this damage looks really bad. Well, it's actually, in some ways, way more efficient than the actual hit damage you're dealing, because the uptime is like virtually 100%. So anyway, the point of all this is to say that there are real world scenarios where just the damage you see through in a theory crafting tool or by calculating it or whatever is not representative of how much you're actually going to deal in a real combat situation. And that you also have to consider other factors like on skills where you have to, let's say, wind up to one big hit or something like that. You need to make sure that you're not spending too much time in between winding up, building stacks of Blade Vortex, casting a Flame Blast and waiting for it to expand so that it does maximal damage, or Divine Ire or something like that. The point is that there are other factors that are hard to truly calculate, which actually majorly impact your real world damage output. So don't be a Path of Building warrior. and just go theorycraft, which, by the way, you should go download Path of Building. It does a lot of this math for you that I'm talking about and really makes your life easier as far as crunching the numbers, but don't rely on it 100% for every decision you make. You have to think about whether there are more practical contributions you could make to sort of allow you to be more effective in real world scenarios when you're dealing your damage. So that's my little soapbox rant at the end of this presentation here. Hopefully it proved useful. Please give me comments if I made mistakes. I'm not going to be defensive about that. I want to make sure that the information I'm getting out is correct. So if you're a more experienced player and you notice me make a mistake and you want to comment on it, please do. If you have further questions, ask in my comments, come in my stream, whatever it is, and I will try to answer them as best I can. And hopefully it was helpful. So, until next time.